I think almost every situation is more nuanced than people would like you to believe that it is. Our brains work in black and white. It's just not accurate to say that all of this group is exactly like this.
Hey, you. Thanks for tuning in. Just a quick heads up, this episode is rated PG-13, so expect to hear some mild language or adult concepts. Today, Sam and I discuss ethics and personal responsibility through a Terry Pratchett book, Guards. There's only one minor spoiler, so if you haven't read the book yet, it's still okay to listen to this. And I wouldn't be surprised if you listen to this episode and then you want to go and read the book. Trust me, it's funny, insightful, creative, and it's a good read. It's a good time. Since Pleasure Central Radio is all about partnership and openness and creating connections with others, I feel like the themes out of this book are just as applicable to interpersonal relationships, whether they be romantic or business relationships, as they are to a society as a whole. So I hope you have a listen. I hope you enjoy it. And I hope you find some inspiration here that clarifies something for you in your own life and makes you think. Welcome to Pleasure Central Radio, the place to rethink the assumptions we don't even realize we are making that keep us from getting what we truly want out of work, life, and love. Here is your sneak peek into an authentic, pleasure-focused conversation. Oh, hello there, Sam.
Hello there, Radiant Rebecca.
It is good to have you back on the show.
It's good to be back on the show. Thanks for having me.
I wanted to talk about another one of my favorite authors' books, and I wanted to talk about it with you for a particular couple of reasons. And I wanted to talk about it now because I think it's very timely with what the nation that I live in is going through, the United States. It's November 2020. We've just had the presidential election with Biden and Trump, and there's no decision yet. We also had a summer full of race riots and a lot of inequality. And so I thought this particular book, this is Guards from Terry Pratchett, would be an interesting, useful, and insightful thing to discuss.
I think that's a very good idea. And you're right. We have just had the election. In fact, the election is still going on. I think one of the late night hosts, I think it was Jimmy Kimmel, said, if your election lasts more than 48 hours, you should see a doctor.
Oh my gosh. That is pretty funny.
But it is interesting that Guards, this fantasy novel by a British author, should be so relevant to our modern times in America. Yet here we are.
And well, it's relevant for surprising reasons, right? There's no election in the book. There's magic and dragons and all kinds of fantasy elements, which we don't have going on right now in the country. But as with pretty much everything that Terry Pratchett does, there's always an underlying current of some human experience. This is, common to human societies all over the place somehow. So that was the reason why I really wanted to talk about it now.
Plus, it features such a terrific and well-named main character.
Yes, it does. Okay. I want to give a little bit of a background for you who are listening there at home. This is one of the first books. I think it is the first book, but it's one of the first books with a series of characters that Terry Pratchett has written a lot about. The series of characters are the Night Watch. And Sam Vimes is one of the first characters that you meet. He's in the Night Watch. When you meet him in this book, I think he's captain or... No, wait, is he? I don't remember. He is in the leadership of the Watch, but he's not very high up yet. And there aren't very many people in the Watch, 2 or 3 people. And over the course of the next, 30, 40 books, he ends up growing into a completely different character, and you see him in a very different capacity. But this is the very first book. And when you meet him here, he starts out in the gutter, completely drunk, and he's got rain running through his armor. And that is the beginning of this character arc.
And the other great character here is Carrot, who is this just strapping young lad, but otherwise really unremarkable. There are some hints at perhaps some lineage that may or may not come into play, but he's just a very average guy, but with an extraordinary sense of right and wrong and ethical behavior. He has a very strict code of ethics, and he expects that everyone else has the same. And if they don't, he very much wants to hold them to this strict code of ethics, including Sam Vimes. And it has a remarkable cascading effect throughout the book.
Yeah, Carrot is a favorite character of mine. And there's a few reasons why I love Carrot so much. First of all, this isn't a spoiler alert. We will let you know when we start sharing some spoilers. But when you meet Carrot, you find out that he was raised in the mines in the mountains by dwarfs. And he was raised as a dwarf. So he's a human. He's 6 feet tall by the time he's 16. But he believes he's just, tall for a dwarf. and being raised in that environment with the dwarf work ethic and the mentality of, hey, we all do this together, we're all working together, I think that has a big effect on who he becomes in this book and in later books as well.
Yes. So one of the things that I think we're dealing with here in America right now, politics and division and class inequality, things like that, they all kind of come into play. And it seems like those are all just very common issues and have been throughout history. And so that's one of the things that even with this fantasy novel about this city where there are poor, there are rich, there are rulers, there is law enforcement, and there are varying degrees of interaction between them all. So it's really interesting to see some of those parallels with what's happening in our country right now and how each person fills their role, each organization fills a role, and the demands that the people have of their leaders and the often competing goals of the rich and the powerful and the leaders and the people. And there's some very interesting but subtle commentary that goes on throughout the book about that. And it's very damn funny.
It is very damn funny. I agree. This is one of those books where I laugh out loud on every other page at least. And everyone who's actually gone and read it has reported the same thing to me. So I think if you're looking for an interesting book that's got some humor and maybe some insight into the world and civilization at large, this is a great one. And one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about this with you in particular is you use the name Sam here on the podcast, but that is an alias. Do you want to tell me why you picked Sam?
Well, early on, we started talking Terry Pratchett and Sam Vimes. I think the first I came across Sam Vimes was in Monstrous Regiment. And his position in that book was far different than it is here. And it also was a very minor role. But then reading Guards, reading The Night Watch, I really got to love Sam Vimes as a character. His leadership style, his interaction in this book and The Night Watch in particular, he's very much in, I guess, what you would consider a middle management role, where he's not necessarily the executive in charge of everything. He's not the officer who's making the decisions. And so he has a very hands-on position where he's mentoring and guiding a lot of younger guys, and in a lot of cases, a very diverse group. And Terry Pratchett just does an amazing job of capturing what an effective leader at that level does. And I think Sam is just a fantastic depiction of a guy with integrity and empathy, also very hard-nosed. He knows when to bring the hammer down, but he's also thinking multiple steps ahead. And so I very much appreciated that character element. And I think it's something I have aspired to and maybe continue to aspire to in any kind of leadership role that I've been in or hope to be in. And I just love the character. I think he's just so spot on with pretty much everything he does, even down to his mistakes, waking up in the gutter with, rainwater and other, rubbish flowing through his armor. I mean, hey, we've all been there, even if it's just figuratively.
Two of my favorite moments in the entire series with Sam Vimes are in the next book that I want to talk about with you called Night Watch. So for those of you listening, check out this one, Guards, and then make sure you listen to Night Watch or read Night Watch, because that's the next one that we're going to be sharing. And they're kind of bookending the story of Sam Vimes. This is the first one where you get introduced to him. Night Watch is one of the last ones. I think there's one more after that, but it's one of the last books where you get to see Sam Vimes doing his thing. And getting to see the whole evolution of that character from the beginning to the end is really, really cool. But two of my favorite things that he does are in Night Watch. One of them is calming a riotous crowd, and the other one is when he's training some of his new recruits to use weapons. And then the second one is there is a new watchman who he's needing to teach a lesson to in front of the other watchmen. It's a really interesting, almost a fight scene, a practice fight scene. But that is not for this episode. That's for another episode. Because I love Terry Pratchett so much, and I can go and re-enjoy his books by going and reading quotes off of the internet from the books. I tend to collect documents with Terry Pratchett quotes. And so I have some. I shared some with you. I know there's a couple that we might want to share on this episode. Did you want to read one or two?
Yeah, I would love to. I love the dedication to this book where he opens it with just sort of seems like a very heartfelt homage. So the dedication is this: they may be called the Palace Guard, the City Guard, or the Patrol. Whatever the name, their purpose in any work of heroic fantasy is identical. It is, round about chapter 3, or 10 minutes into the film, to rush into the room, attack the hero one at a time, and be slaughtered. No one ever asks them if they wanted to. This book is dedicated to those fine men.
Yeah. I like that.
You could read that various ways. It's either those poor dumb bastards who are not smart enough to know what's good for them. But you can also read it in a generous way that these guys are just like dedicated to doing what they've trained and taught to do. And, they rush in there willingly, even though clearly the author who's controlling things did not ask them if they want to rush in there and get slaughtered one by one.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. We've just had all of these riots this year, and the tide against law enforcement is definitely turned. It's not really a good thing to be law enforcement in our general society right now. But I grew up surrounded by law enforcement rangers. I grew up in a national park, and a lot of the people that lived on our street and in our neighborhood were law enforcement rangers. That was just, their temporary housing. That's where they stayed. So my family knew them. We would have them over for picnics. And you have, your own history and your own background in the military. So very different experiences than, what we're seeing in the police departments and the police brutality that has been so much talked about this year. I'm curious, is it interesting for you to talk about it this way right now?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. And one thing that I think I really like about Sam Vimes is he's very clear-eyed about almost everything. And I mean, there are some, instances where, there's application of brute force by Sam Vimes and his fellow, watchmen. But he's also very careful to be on the side of the people. And I think within the military, within law enforcement, within Black Lives Matter, within, any of these elements that may have epithets hurled at them and, they may be painted with a broad brush. It's just not accurate to say that all of this group is exactly like this. Because like you said, having been around law enforcement, having been around military, it's easy to recognize that there are some really good people who are genuinely there to serve and protect. And, the same thing within the military, that people who've joined to just serve the country. But it's also easy to see how that can get sidetracked. And like in this book, the guards are clearly not the professional organization that they should be.
Not yet.
Particularly not at the beginning, right?
Yes.
Yes. And so I think almost every situation is more nuanced than people would like you to believe that it is. Our brains work in black and white. And so we like to see things in these, binary terms of it's like this or this. And it's hard to say, oh, well, sure, this just needs a little tweaking, or, we should take a slightly different approach. It's so much easier to say defund the police than it is to say we should reallocate funds so that policemen are better trained and are not having to act as healthcare professionals, when really what we need a lot of times is mental health and general health care, as well as affordable housing. And the police shouldn't have to deal with some of these problems that aren't necessarily in their specialty. Defund the police just sounds so much better.
It's catchier, right?
It's so much catchier, so we're in that unfortunate position where it seems like what people are after is scoring points, like we're in a zinger contest, rather than an actual, like, let's have a good political discussion based on, good faith arguments and a mutual understanding that we want things to be better for everyone.
Yeah, and I think that's gotten exacerbated a bit in the last few years, the last decade or two here, especially in the US. Well, that's where I live, so that's where I'm seeing it the most. But it's almost like having an actual conversation about what might work is really low on everybody's priority list. But because you can make something a soundbite, and you can just get people all riled up and excited about something. But that's not the same thing as actually considering what's going to be best here and having conversations, getting enough information and enough data to figure out what an actual fix could be.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
Yeah, one of the things that I find so interesting about this book is there's this theme of not taking responsibility for yourself and for your actions. So we're starting to get into some of the spoilers here. This isn't quite a spoiler yet because you learn about it at the very beginning of the book, but it starts out with a man who is trying to create havoc, gain some power, and he does this by gathering people into a secret society, but he gathers the worst of the worst. He gathers all of the people that wouldn't be accepted into any other secret society. And in fact, I think there's a quote about it here. What was it? Let the other societies take the skilled, the hopefuls, the ambitious, the self-confident. He'd take the whining, resentful ones, the ones with a belly full of spite and bile, the ones who knew they could make it big if only they'd been given the chance. Give him the ones in which the floods of venom and vindictiveness were dammed up behind thin walls of ineptitude and low-grade paranoia. And then in contrast, there's Carrot, who is all about responsibility and doing what's right and doing what's important to you. So having that counterpoint of those two different energies and how they're interacting with each other.
Yes. Well, I think one thing that's remarkable about the character of Carrot is, you mentioned he was raised by dwarves, thinks he is a dwarf, which kind of funny. It's like Will Ferrell in Elf. He just thinks he's a really big elf, and Carrot thinks he's a really big dwarf. But none of Carrot's physical characteristics or anything like the good things that happen to him, he absolutely does not put himself on a pedestal. He absolutely holds himself to a high standard. He thinks he's right, but not in a way that makes him sort of vain and thinks he's the best. One of my favorite quotes, and I think yours in this book, about when Carrot travels to the city. He had a very uneventful journey. And he says, people who are rather more than 6 feet tall and nearly as broad across the shoulders often have uneventful journeys. People jump out at them from behind rocks, then say things like, oh, sorry, I thought you were someone else.
Yes, I do love that part.
That's a great one. But none of that goes to Carrot's head. He's one of those guys who is not at all accusatory, but just lives by the code on his own. Rather than preaching to everybody about how they're not measuring up, he just completely lives by his standards.
Yeah, he's a very interesting guy. So growing up, and I know we both grew up in the same religion, not in the same city or the same church, but growing up, my parents were pretty strict about not letting me play any sports on Saturday, which was the Sabbath that we were observing in our family. And there was a point in time when I was a teenager when I was getting good at basketball. I really wanted to play. And I had to decide for myself, am I going to find a way to do it anyway? And I did both. I did sneak out once and I did play a game on Saturday. And I found, especially as a teenager, especially surrounded by other teenagers that were just doing whatever they wanted, they were often denying or rebelling against what their parents were telling them to do, that being different actually gave me a lot of power. Not self-righteous power. It just gave me a lot of, like, oh, I have control over this and I can do something that no one else is doing. That happens to be really hard. I was on the basketball team and I wanted to play, and we almost only had games on Saturdays. So I think there was a year where I only played twice in games because of the schedule of the basketball. But getting to make that decision for myself and then doing something that was hard, that my peers weren't doing, that I was getting peer pressure to do the opposite of, was a really valuable experience. It gave me a lot of understanding of myself and of the inner power that I had. I'm wondering if you had anything like that.
Yeah, I think that happens a lot if you're already not just going along with the crowd because it's the easy thing to do. You're right that it does give you a certain power in that you're already demonstrating that you're not just conforming with everything that your peers or cohort are doing. And so that gives you an opportunity to, once you've made that one choice that's different from everyone else, it makes the next choice a little bit easier. You're not having to break out of the mold. You're already out of the mold. And in that case, you can just embrace it. Embrace the differences that you have, and in a way that doesn't have to denigrate anyone or say that they're wrong. But as with Carrot, he sees it one way and he's going to act in accordance with what he already sees. And so that already sets him apart. And so when he gets to the watch, he's not the new guy who's just trying to fit in and go along with everything that's happening. He just has that strict code and is going with it.
And spoiler alert, to the point where he arrests the ruler of the city.
Yes, exactly. And his adherence to the letter of the law creates all kinds of difficulties for the watch, but ultimately creates a lot of respect for Carrot and the way he's approaching things. And it's really neat the way it has that cumulative effect of getting, in particular, Sam Vimes to sort of remember what it is to be part of the watch, and then just start to spread that to other members.
And I love that it's sort of like a positive virus. It's a virus of integrity, where he says, this is what's important to me. This is what I'm going to do. And all of a sudden the people around him are going, oh yeah, maybe I shouldn't be, checking the door handles of all the shops at night to see if they're still open. Though I don't think Nobby ever changes his ways, right? Nobby
Right.
is a particularly interesting character in the watch. He's one of the few people left when the watch is almost dead.
And that's, when I talk about the things that I admire about Sam and why I took that name for my podcast moniker, is Sam definitely, he has his faults for sure. He's not perfect, but he takes people where they are. And, so him mentioning, like, are you kicking a man when he's down? It's not a direct, hey, stop doing that. But he's clear about letting his guys know what he finds acceptable and what he expects for them to do. So he may not be trying to make everyone absolutely Judge Dredd style robots, but he's moving them in the direction of being better people, being better officers of the law, being better at interacting with the public. And so I like that he's drawing them along slowly and along with himself.
Yeah, I do like that. And I think it's also interesting to see the way that the mundane characters, the ones that end up in the secret society with this essentially the bad guy antagonist of the entire story, they're all fairly innocent. Like, they're not awful people. They just have this vile and blame that they've allowed to build up inside them, and that's part of the power that he uses to create this magical character that ends up terrorizing the city. And there's a couple of quotes in here about it. The people next door oppress me all night long. I tell them I work all day. A man's got to have some time to learn to play the tuba. That's oppression, that is. If I'm not under the heel of the oppressor, I don't know who is.
Everyone's version of oppression. And that's the other genius that I think Terry Pratchett has of, he's not, even in the dedication where he talks about the guards or the patrol or whatever you call them, rushing in and doing their thing against, clearly in that dedication, he's casting them not as the good guys because they're rushing in and attacking the hero of the story. But he doesn't label them, as bad. They're not evil. And so his understanding of, I think, the masses is pretty interesting. One of the quotes that you had referred to that you really liked was from this book. Down there are people who will follow any dragon, worship any god, ignore any inequity, all out of a kind of humdrum everyday badness. Not the really high creative loathsomeness of the great sinners, but a sort of mass-produced darkness of the soul. Sin, you might say, without a trace of originality. They accept evil not because they say yes, but because they don't say no. And I think that does such a great job of capturing the herd mentality that can lead large groups to accept things that really are just not, if you had to ask them individually, would you, support this? Well, of course not. But then you get enough people just acquiescing, bad things happen. And so it's really neat how he takes that concept and then injects some quality people, and you see how things turn out.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting, too, that those mildly bad people are the ones that the really, really bad person is able to use as fodder against the city.
Well, it's just so painfully obvious with what's going on in our country right now that we're very easily divided, and we're very easily made to feel that the other side is composed of the other. And it's us versus them, no matter which side you're on. It's easy to create a caricature of the other side of the argument, the other side of politics, and in a way that's just not helpful and doesn't recognize our shared humanity, our shared desire for happiness and, peace and prosperity and good things for our kids. And, so if we could look beyond those surface differences, it would be a lot easier to see when you're getting played. or used. Not necessarily played, but people are trying to manipulate the masses for, whatever reason. And you can say trying to inspire them. Our side is just trying to inspire people, and your side is trying to manipulate you, when we have so much more in common than we have different. And it'd be really great if we could focus on that for a while.
It would be really great. It's interesting. I was listening to you say that, and I'm trying to figure out whether I agree and how much I agree.
Ooh.
Yeah, I think for myself, it's less about trying to figure out if you're being played or if you're being used. And it's more about, hey, am I living in alignment with my values right now? Because that's what really matters to me. And I would like it to matter to other people. I think if it mattered to more and more people, hey, am I living in alignment with my values right now? Then we would have a bit of a different situation here, instead of trying to say, okay, well, what's the best I can do given this situation? There's not a lot of power in that question. But if we're able to look at ourselves and say, okay, what actually matters to me? What are the values that I care about? And then how can I communicate those in a way that I'm able to connect with other people?
I think you're right that if Carrot is such a great example of someone who could very easily and understandably start to shift his values to be more in alignment with his coworkers, his boss, the situation. I mean, come on, this is a kid who, grew up with dwarves, like working in a mine, to the point where he's a little stooped over. And it would be easy for Carrot to get to the city and change to accommodate his new situation and to excuse it easily in his own mind. Things are different here. I'll act differently. I'll let things slide. After all, I'm not in charge. The boss says, let it go. Okay, I'll let it go. And rather than do that, he, like you said, lives in alignment with his values. And that's what creates the significant effect. And so I think if more people could truly assess their values and make sure that they're living in alignment with that, then they would see where they're getting pulled out of alignment.
And I think they would have more satisfying lives, no matter who's president, no matter what dragon is terrorizing the city, etc. Because I think built into that, knowing what your own values are and deciding to live them, there's a lot of accepting of personal responsibility in that.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's one more piece. This is when he's talking about the secret society. And he's talking about how easy it is to get this small band of misfits to go along with his mystic plans without really telling them what it is. He says things like, it was amazing, this mystic business. You tell them a lie, and then when you don't need it anymore, you tell them another lie. And then when they're progressing along the road to wisdom, then instead of laughing, they follow you even more, hoping that at the heart of all the lies, they'll find the truth. And bit by bit, they accept the unacceptable. Amazing. That's a little spooky, huh?
That is a little spooky.
In the year of there's no such thing as facts.
The post-fact world.
Yes.
Well, and that makes me think of another quote from this. One of the things forgotten about the human spirit is that while it is, in the right conditions, noble and brave and wonderful, it is also, when you get right down to it, only human.
Yes. I do love that too. Well, what can we take from this book into our real lives?
The thing that I took from this, it's a fun combination of like lessons from like be more like Carrot and be more like Sam Vimes. And I think it's some measure of both, where Carrot is just so dyed in the wool good. He's just a good guy. And he's unwavering in that. And so I think there's something very admirable about that characteristic and about that character. And so it's definitely something to aspire to. On the other hand, without Sam Vimes, who understands human nature better than Carrot does, because Carrot grew up in a very particular situation. Sam has been, definitely deeply immersed in all of the variations of the human condition. So he comes to all of these situations with a broader understanding of people and their weaknesses and their strengths. And so he takes inspiration from Carrot, but he ultimately is the one who makes the difference by meeting people where they are and changing other people's minds and behaviors in a way that gets it more closely aligned with, Carrot's very strict black and white outlook. But I think it's really interesting that you have these two characters that together have a very positive effect, whereas either one on their own would not have been nearly so successful.
I agree. I think what I'm taking out of this is there should always be someone in law enforcement that is willing to arrest the ruler.
That is an excellent, excellent point. Yes.
There's one more quote that I don't think I wrote down where Vetinari, the patrician of the city, the ruler, gets arrested and thrown into his own dungeon. And the quote is about, if everyone would build a dungeon that they wouldn't mind spending time in, the world would be a better place.
Very nice.
And his dungeon is actually quite nice. There's some fun little surprises in there. He's got a bunch of trained rats to bring him library books and all kinds of cool things. Oh, and then the last one was about a library. Did we say? I don't think we said this.
Oh, yes, the library.
Yeah. Okay, we got to remember this, because for my book, education and knowledge is definitely one of the most powerful things that any of us can have.
Yeah, the quote about the library, which right from the beginning of this book, the library is sort of the source of a large part of the mischief. But the quote is, people were stupid sometimes. They thought the library was a dangerous place because of all the magical books, which was true enough. But what made it really one of the most dangerous places there could ever be was the simple fact that it was a library.
Yes. Knowledge is power.
Knowledge is power.
All right. Well, with that, I'm going to say this is a wonderful episode. Thank you for having another insightful and interesting conversation with me about Terry Pratchett and Guards.
Well, thank you for having me on. And I'm very much looking forward to our next discussion of Terry Pratchett.
Sam, get some good rest and get prepped on Night Watch. That's next.
Thank you, Rebecca. It's been a pleasure.
Hey, Pleasure Seeker. Well, that's it for today's conversation. Here at Pleasure Central Radio, we love using conscious communication, science geekery, and copious amounts of true pleasure to improve our partnerships, our money, and our love lives. And we hope you do too. If you loved what you heard here, we'd love a review. You can listen to other episodes of the podcast and read thought-provoking essays or poems written by me, Radiant Rebecca, by checking out the blog on pleasurecentralpodcast.com. Sign up to hear about new episodes immediately at pleasurecentralpodcast.com. Your thought to ponder today is,
built into that, knowing what your own values are and deciding to live them, there's a lot of accepting of personal responsibility in that.
Yeah, absolutely.